I'm going to need you to step aside for additional screening.
Officer, on what grounds? The detector didn't alert. Explain the cause.
It's a random check. Cooperate.
Then state the policy you're following. On camera.
The security checkpoint alarm hadn't even finished ringing when Judge Marcus Williams knew his life was about to change forever. Standing there in his perfectly pressed Navy suit, briefcase in hand, he watched as 3 airport security officers approached him with expressions that made his blood run cold. What they didn't realize was that they had just made the most catastrophic mistake of their careers. A mistake that would expose a web of corruption, racial bias, and abuse of power that reached far deeper than anyone could have imagined. Judge Marcus Williams was 52 years old and had spent the last 15 years on the bench. He was known throughout the legal community as a no-nonsense judge who ran his courtroom with an iron fist. Defense attorneys respected him, prosecutors feared him, and criminals knew that appearing before Judge Williams meant they were in for the fight of their lives. He had built his reputation on being tough but fair, never showing favoritism regardless of race, class, or connections. That Tuesday morning in November, Judge Williams was traveling to a judicial conference in another state. He had an early flight, which meant arriving at the airport by 6:30 inches the morning. The terminal was relatively quiet, just a handful of business travelers and early commuters making their way through security. Williams had made this same trip dozens of times over the years. He knew the routine by heart. He placed his briefcase and shoes in the plastic bins, walked through the metal detector, and waited for his belongings on the other side. That's when Officer Danny Rodriguez noticed something that caught his attention. Not something suspicious about Judge Williams' behavior or belongings, but something that triggered a different kind of response altogether. Officer Rodriguez had been working airport security for 8 years. He considered himself experienced, professional, and thorough. What he didn't consider himself was particularly intelligent or observant when it came to reading people. Because if he had been, he might have noticed the quiet confidence in Judge Williams' posture. He might have seen the expensive watch, the quality of the suit, or the leather briefcase that cost more than Rodriguez made in a month. Instead, all Rodriguez saw was a well-dressed black man traveling alone through his checkpoint. Rodriguez called over his supervisor, a woman named Janet Pierce, who had been running security operations at this particular checkpoint for over a decade. Pierce took one look at Judge Williams and nodded to Rodriguez. Without any verbal communication, both officers understood exactly what was about to happen. It was a routine they had performed countless times before. Judge Williams collected his briefcase and was putting on his shoes when Officer Rodriguez approached him. The officer asked him to step aside for additional screening. Williams looked up, slightly confused but not yet concerned. He asked if there was a problem with his luggage or if he had forgotten to remove something from his pockets. Rodriguez didn't answer the question directly. Instead, he simply repeated that additional screening was required. This is where the story takes its first dramatic turn, because Judge Williams, unlike so many others who had been targeted by these officers before, didn't just comply quietly. He wasn't intimidated or flustered. Instead, he did something that Rodriguez and Pierce had never encountered in all their years of conducting these questionable stops. He started asking the right questions. Williams asked Rodriguez to specify exactly what had triggered the additional screening. He asked if his luggage had tested positive for any prohibited substances. He asked if the metal detector had indicated any concerns. Rodriguez fumbled through his answers, clearly unprepared for someone who understood how security protocols actually worked. Judge Williams then asked to speak with a supervisor. Rodriguez pointed to Pierce, who was standing just a few feet away, obviously listening to every word of the conversation. Williams approached Pierce and introduced himself politely but firmly. He explained that he was a frequent traveler, that nothing about his screening process had seemed unusual, and that he would like to understand why he was being singled out for additional attention. Pierce's response was what would later become the centerpiece of the entire controversy. She told Judge Williams that his selection for additional screening was completely random. When he pointed out that he could see at least 6 other passengers who had gone through the same metal detector without any additional screening, Pierce became defensive. She said that questioning security procedures was itself suspicious behavior. Judge Williams remained calm, but those who knew him well would have recognized the slight tightening around his eyes. It was the same look he got in his courtroom when a lawyer tried to present evidence that had been obtained illegally or when a witness attempted to lie under oath. It was the look of a man who had spent his entire career identifying deception and was now seeing it deployed against him personally. He asked Pierce for her name and badge number. She reluctantly provided both pieces of information, clearly annoyed by the request. Williams then asked if their conversation was being recorded by security cameras. Pierce confirmed that it was, though she seemed to regret admitting it the moment the words left her mouth. At this point, Officer Rodriguez returned with a handheld metal detection wand. He instructed Judge Williams to spread his arms and legs for a pat-down search. Williams complied, but he also did something else. He pulled out his phone and began recording the interaction. The moment that camera came out, the entire dynamic shifted. Pierce immediately told Williams to put the phone away, claiming that recording security procedures was prohibited. Williams calmly explained that he was in a public area of the airport and had every right to record his own interaction with public officials. He also mentioned that if airport security had concerns about transparency, perhaps they should reconsider their procedures. Rodriguez completed his pat-down search, finding absolutely nothing. He then announced that Judge Williams' briefcase would need to be hand-searched. Williams watched as Rodriguez opened his briefcase and began removing items one by one. Legal documents, a laptop computer, pens, business cards, and a small leather portfolio containing his judicial credentials. Rodriguez picked up the portfolio and started flipping through it. His expression changed dramatically when he saw Judge Williams' judicial identification card. The color drained from his face as he realized exactly who he had been treating like a potential criminal for the past 10 minutes. He quickly showed the portfolio to Pierce, whose own expression shifted from annoyance to something approaching panic. But here's where the story becomes even more interesting. Instead of immediately apologizing and ending the search, Pierce doubled down. She claimed that judicial credentials didn't exempt anyone from security screening and that they would continue their procedures regardless of Williams' position. She said this loud enough for other passengers to hear, as if she wanted to make sure everyone knew she wasn't going to be intimidated by his title. Judge Williams closed his eyes for a moment, took a deep breath, and made a decision that would change everything. Instead of pulling rank, instead of demanding special treatment, instead of using his position to end this harassment, he decided to let it continue. He wanted to see exactly how far these officers would go. He wanted to document every detail of their behavior, because he suspected that what was happening to him had happened to countless other travelers who didn't have his knowledge, his resources, or his platform to fight back. What Judge Williams didn't know was that his instinct was absolutely correct. What he was experiencing wasn't an isolated incident or a case of overzealous security. It was part of a systematic pattern of racial profiling that had been going on for years, targeting successful black travelers who had the audacity to look prosperous while flying. Pierce instructed Rodriguez to conduct a more thorough search of Williams's belongings. She wanted every document examined, every pocket of his briefcase explored, and every electronic device inspected. Williams stood there patiently, his phone still recording, as these two officers systematically violated every principle of reasonable security screening. Rodriguez pulled out Williams' laptop and announced that it would need to be powered on and examined. Williams complied, entering his password and allowing the officer to scroll through his desktop. Rodriguez clicked on several files, opening confidential court documents and case notes that contained sensitive information about ongoing legal proceedings. This crossed a line that even Pierce seemed to recognize. She quietly told Rodriguez to close the laptop, but the damage was already done. Judge Williams had just witnessed these officers accessing privileged attorney-client communications and confidential judicial materials without any legal authority whatsoever. The search continued for another 15 minutes. Other passengers began to gather, some recording on their own phones, others simply staring at the spectacle unfolding before them. A well-dressed black man being subjected to treatment that no other traveler in sight was experiencing. The optics were terrible, and Pierce knew it, but she seemed unable to find a way out of the situation she had created. Officer Rodriguez found nothing suspicious because there was nothing suspicious to find. Judge Williams was exactly what he appeared to be. A respected federal judge traveling to a professional conference with nothing more dangerous than legal documents and a laptop computer. When the search finally concluded, Pierce handed Williams his belongings with what could generously be described as a non-apology. She said the screening was complete and that he was free to proceed to his gate. No explanation for why he had been selected. No acknowledgement that the search had been unusually intrusive. No recognition that they had just spent 20 minutes harassing an innocent traveler. Judge Williams packed his briefcase methodically, taking his time to ensure everything was properly organized. He was in no hurry now. His flight was boarding, but he had something more important to do than catch his plane. He approached Pierce one final time and asked for the contact information of her supervisor. She reluctantly provided the name and phone number of the airport security director. Williams also requested incident report forms and asked how he could obtain copies of the security footage from their interaction. Pierce's demeanor shifted again. She became defensive, asking why he needed all this information. Williams smiled for the first time since the encounter began. It wasn't a friendly smile. It was the smile of a predator who had just spotted vulnerable prey. He told Pierce that he intended to file a formal complaint about their conduct. He mentioned that he found their screening procedures questionable and their explanations insufficient. He said he planned to review the incident thoroughly and determine whether any policies or laws had been violated. What he didn't tell Pierce was that he had already identified at least 6 potential federal violations in their conduct. Unlawful search and seizure, violation of attorney-client privilege, discrimination based on race, abuse of authority. And that was just from the first 10 minutes of their interaction. Williams missed his flight, of course, but he didn't seem particularly concerned about it. He spent the next hour at the airport making phone calls. First to his assistant, instructing her to reschedule his conference appearances, then to a colleague who specialized in civil rights law, then to the media relations office of the federal judiciary. By the time he boarded a later flight that afternoon, the wheels were already in motion. His phone contained a 20-minute video documenting every detail of his harassment. His briefcase contained business cards from 3 passengers who had witnessed the entire incident and volunteered to serve as witnesses. His notebook contained detailed written observations about the officers' behavior, their statements, and their violations of established security protocols. But Judge Williams was just getting started. During his flight, he used the airplane's Wi-Fi to research Officer Rodriguez and Supervisor Pierce. What he discovered made his jaw clench with anger that he rarely allowed himself to feel. Pierce had been the subject of 4 previous complaints for discriminatory screening practices. All 4 complaints had been filed by Black or Hispanic travelers. All 4 complaints had been dismissed as unsubstantiated by the airport's internal review process. The pattern was unmistakable to anyone who knew how to look for it. Rodriguez had been involved in 3 similar incidents over the past 2 years. Each time, he had subjected minority travelers to unusually intensive screening procedures that yielded no security concerns. Each time, the travelers had complained. Each time, their complaints had been buried in bureaucratic processes designed to protect officers rather than address misconduct. When Judge Williams' plane landed at his destination, he had already formulated a comprehensive strategy. This wasn't going to be a simple complaint filed through normal channels and forgotten. This was going to be a systematic dismantling of the culture that had allowed officers like Rodriguez and Pierce to operate with impunity for years. He called his wife from the airport and explained what had happened. She wasn't surprised. As a successful Black attorney herself, she had experienced similar treatment during her own travels. But she was surprised by the intensity of determination she heard in her husband's voice. She knew that tone. It was the same tone he used when he was about to deliver a sentence that would change someone's life forever. Judge Williams checked into his hotel and spent the evening preparing. Not for his conference presentation, which he had given dozens of times before, but for the war he was about to declare on institutional racism within airport security. He drafted a detailed timeline of events, cross-referenced with the timestamps from his video recording. He researched federal statutes governing airport security procedures and constitutional protections against unreasonable search and seizure. He identified the specific policies that Rodriguez and Pierce had violated and the remedies available under federal law. Most importantly, he began reaching out to his network of contacts throughout the federal judiciary. Judge Williams had spent 15 years building relationships with colleagues, law enforcement officials, civil rights attorneys, and media professionals. Now he was going to leverage every single one of those relationships to ensure that what happened to him would never happen to another innocent traveler. The next morning, he made a phone call that would set everything in motion. He contacted the office of the United States Attorney for the district where the airport was located. The prosecutor who took his call initially seemed skeptical. After all, airport security incidents were usually handled as administrative matters, not federal criminal cases. But when Judge Williams finished explaining exactly what had occurred, including the officers' access to privileged legal documents and their systematic pattern of targeting minority travelers, the prosecutor's tone changed completely. This wasn't just a complaint about rude treatment. This was potential evidence of a federal conspiracy to violate civil rights under color of law. Within hours, FBI agents were reviewing security footage from the airport checkpoint. Federal prosecutors were examining Pierce and Rodriguez's employment records, and civil rights attorneys were preparing what would become one of the most significant discrimination lawsuits in airport security history. Pierce and Rodriguez had no idea what was coming. They returned to work the next day, assuming that their encounter with the well-dressed black man was just another routine incident that would be forgotten within a week. They had no way of knowing that they had just provided a federal judge with everything he needed to expose years of systematic discrimination and abuse of power. Judge Williams spent the rest of that week methodically building his case. Every phone call was strategic. Every document was carefully reviewed. Every piece of evidence was cataloged with the precision of someone who had spent decades in courtrooms. But what Rodriguez and Pierce still didn't understand was that their problems were about to get exponentially worse. The FBI investigation moved faster than anyone expected. Agent Sarah Chen had been assigned to the case, and she brought 15 years of civil rights investigation experience to the table. What she discovered in the first 48 hours of reviewing airport security footage made her stomach turn. The cameras had captured everything. Not just Judge Williams' harassment, but months of similar incidents involving other travelers. Pierce and Rodriguez had been systematically targeting well-dressed Black and Hispanic passengers, subjecting them to invasive searches that white travelers never experienced. The pattern was so obvious that Agent Chen wondered how it had gone undetected for so long. The answer to that question came when she started digging into the airport's complaint process. Every single complaint filed against Pierce and Rodriguez over the past 3 years had been handled by the same administrator, a man named Tom Bradley, who had apparently made it his personal mission to protect these officers from any consequences for their actions. Bradley had been dismissing complaints without proper investigation. He had been filing incident reports that minimized the officers' misconduct. He had been coaching Pierce and Rodriguez on how to write their statements to avoid admitting wrongdoing. What Agent Chen had uncovered wasn't just individual racism, it was institutional corruption designed to enable and protect that racism. Meanwhile, Judge Williams was making strategic moves of his own. He reached out to colleagues who had experienced similar treatment during their travels. The stories that came back to him were infuriating and heartbreaking in equal measure. Judge Patricia Washington from Chicago described being pulled aside for additional screening every single time she flew, despite having TSA pre-check status. Judge Robert Martinez from Texas told him about officers who had insisted on searching through his confidential court documents, claiming they looked suspicious. Judge Angela Brooks from Florida had been subjected to invasive pat-downs so frequently that she had started driving to conferences instead of flying. What became clear was that successful Black and Hispanic judges weren't isolated targets. They were part of a broader pattern of harassment that extended to doctors, lawyers, business executives, and anyone whose appearance challenged the stereotypes that officers like Rodriguez and Pierce carried in their heads. Judge Williams compiled these accounts into a comprehensive report that he shared with the FBI, the Department of Justice, and the Federal Aviation Administration. He also leaked portions of it to investigative journalists who had been covering discrimination in airport security for years. The media response was swift and brutal. National news outlets picked up the story within days. The video that Judge Williams had recorded became Exhibit A in a national conversation about racial profiling in airport security. Cable news programs played the footage repeatedly, showing Rodriguez and Pierce treating a federal judge like a criminal suspect. The optics were devastating for the airport authority. Here was a distinguished jurist, a man who had dedicated his career to upholding the law, being humiliated by officers who couldn't articulate a single legitimate reason for their actions. The contrast between Williams' calm professionalism and the officer's obvious bias was impossible to ignore. Pierce and Rodriguez found themselves at the center of a media firestorm they were completely unprepared to handle. Their names and faces were plastered across newspapers and television screens nationwide. Their employment records were dissected by journalists who had obtained them through Freedom of Information requests. Their personal lives were scrutinized by reporters who wanted to understand how people with such obvious biases had been allowed to remain in positions of authority. The airport authority's initial response was predictably defensive. They released a statement claiming that their officers had followed proper procedures and that any allegations of discrimination were unfounded. This response lasted exactly 48 hours, which was how long it took for Agent Chen to provide them with a preview of what the FBI investigation had uncovered. Suddenly, the airport authority was singing a very different tune. They announced that Pierce and Rodriguez had been placed on administrative leave pending a full investigation. They promised to review all security procedures and implement additional training on bias prevention. They hired an outside consulting firm to conduct a comprehensive audit of their screening practices, but Judge Williams wasn't interested in their damage control efforts. He had seen too many instances where institutions promised reform only to return to their old practices once the media attention died down. He wanted accountability, not just apologies. Working with civil rights attorney Michelle Roberts, Judge Williams filed a federal lawsuit that sought both monetary damages and systemic reform. The lawsuit named Pierce and Rodriguez as individual defendants, along with their supervisor Tom Bradley and the airport authority itself. It alleged violations of the Fourth Amendment, the Equal Protection Clause, and multiple federal civil rights statutes. The lawsuit detailed not just Judge Williams's experience, but the experiences of dozens of other travelers who had been subjected to discriminatory treatment by the same officers. It included statistical analysis showing that Pierce and Rodriguez had searched black passengers at rates far exceeding any reasonable security justification. It documented the airport authority's deliberate indifference to complaints about discriminatory practices. Most damaging of all, the lawsuit included excerpts from internal emails and text messages that Agent Chen had uncovered during her investigation. Messages where Pierce and Rodriguez had made explicitly racist comments about passengers they were targeting. Messages where they had joked about making certain travelers miss their flights. Messages that revealed the harassment wasn't just bias-driven, but intentionally malicious. Rodriguez had written to a colleague that he enjoyed putting uppity travelers in their place. Pierce had sent text messages complaining about fancy-dressed thugs who thought they were better than airport security officers. These communications provided direct evidence of the discriminatory intent that civil rights lawsuits often struggle to prove. The legal discovery process revealed even more disturbing information. Pierce and Rodriguez had been given performance evaluations that actually praised them for their thoroughness in conducting security screenings. Their supervisors had been aware of the complaint pattern but had interpreted it as evidence that the officers were doing their jobs effectively. Tom Bradley, the administrator who had been dismissing complaints, had been receiving bonuses based partly on keeping complaint resolution numbers low. The system had been designed to reward the very behavior that was violating travelers' constitutional rights. Judge Williams testified in his own deposition, with the same calm authority he brought to his courtroom. He walked the defense attorneys through every detail of his experience, providing timestamps, identifying witnesses, and explaining exactly how each action by Pierce and Rodriguez had violated established security protocols. When Rodriguez's attorney tried to argue that the search had been conducted according to standard procedures, Judge Williams smiled that same predatory smile Pierce had seen at the airport. He pulled out a thick binder containing the actual TSA guidelines and began reading the specific sections that Rodriguez had violated. He had done his homework, and it showed. Pierce's deposition was a disaster for the defense. Under questioning from attorney Michelle Roberts, Pierce admitted that she had never received training on how to conduct unbiased security screening. She acknowledged that the vast majority of her intensive searches involved minority passengers. When asked to explain the statistical disparity, she claimed it was just coincidence. Roberts then showed Pierce printouts of her own text messages, including ones where she had used racial slurs to describe passengers. Pierce's attorney objected repeatedly, but the evidence was overwhelming. These weren't the actions of officers making good faith security decisions. These were the actions of individuals using their authority to act on personal prejudices. The case never made it to trial. Faced with evidence that would have guaranteed a massive jury verdict, the airport authority agreed to settle for $8.5 million. But more importantly, from Judge Williams' perspective, they agreed to implement comprehensive reforms designed to prevent future discrimination. The settlement required the airport to fire Pierce, Rodriguez, and Tom Bradley immediately. It mandated bias training for all security personnel. It established an independent oversight board to investigate discrimination complaints. It required statistical monitoring of search patterns to identify potential bias before it became systematic. Judge Williams donated his portion of the settlement to civil rights organizations working on airport security reform. He said the money had never been his motivation. His motivation had been ensuring that no other traveler would have to endure what he had experienced. The ripple effects of the case extended far beyond one airport. The Department of Transportation used the settlement as a model for reforms at airports nationwide. Other travelers who had been subjected to discriminatory treatment found attorneys willing to take their cases, knowing that Judge Williams had established important legal precedents. Pierce and Rodriguez found themselves unemployable in law enforcement or security. Their names were too closely associated with racial profiling for any agency to risk hiring them. Rodriguez eventually found work as a warehouse security guard, making a fraction of his former salary. Pierce left the security field entirely and took a job in retail management. Tom Bradley faced federal criminal charges for his role in covering up the discriminatory practices. He pleaded guilty to violating civil rights under color of law and was sentenced to 18 months in federal prison. His conviction sent a clear message to other administrators that protecting discriminatory officers could result in personal criminal liability. But perhaps the most significant outcome was the cultural change that Judge Williams' case helped accelerate. His willingness to fight back, combined with the undeniable evidence he had gathered, made it impossible for institutions to dismiss discrimination complaints as isolated incidents or misunderstandings. Other judges began speaking publicly about their own experiences with biased treatment during travel. Professional organizations started tracking discrimination complaints and pushing for systemic reforms. The legal community recognized that even their most prominent members weren't immune to the kind of harassment that ordinary citizens had been enduring for years. Agent Chen continued investigating similar cases at airports across the country. The techniques she had developed while investigating Pierce and Rodriguez became standard procedure for civil rights investigations. She testified before Congress about the need for better oversight of airport security practices and helped draft legislation that strengthened protections against discriminatory treatment. Judge Williams returned to his courtroom with a deeper understanding of how institutional bias operated and how difficult it could be for ordinary citizens to challenge. He began incorporating that perspective into his judicial decisions, particularly in cases involving police misconduct or civil rights violations. Judge Williams proved that sometimes justice requires more than just wearing a robe. It requires the courage to fight back when institutions fail, and the determination to ensure that your experience becomes the last time it happens to anyone else. Rodriguez and Pierce thought they could intimidate a successful black man with impunity. Instead, They handed him the evidence he needed to dismantle their entire system of discrimination and send a message that would echo through airports nationwide. This case was intense, but this case on the right-hand side is even more insane.